Good morning and a warm welcome to the third edition of iCAAD in Paris. My name is Christophe Verwein. I am the director and founder of iCAAD. As you can hear, I am French. I work in London also. And I just want to say a word about iCAAD. iCAAD was born many years ago under another name and became iCAAD 3 years ago. It's an independent organization which has a simple purpose to share, widen, deepen know-how on mental health, behavioral health, especially in terms of addiction. It's a platform, a place of discussion, of debate, of knowledge. It's a theoretical and practical place, depending on the conferences and the country. It has many different forms. It's a non-profit organization, an independent organization, an European organization based in London. So I don't know if it'll stay European very long, but we want to work in Europe. We have Paris also, Brussels, Stockholm, Rome, Istanbul this year. We have projects in Ireland, in Holland. So real a European scope, because suffering is human, it's not national. So the aim is to help people share our ways of meeting or answering suffering. We're stronger together. So I wanted to say that to you about iCAAD. Another important thing, so we are independent. We work with support, or thanks to support, otherwise it wouldn't be financially possible. So our number one, our key support is you, yourselves. You participate, you support us financially, but we have other financial partners. So I just wanted to say a word on these partners. They are very European. Noah McDermott, English, Paraset, Swiss, Montenemus, Portuguese, Withersdane, English, Promise, English, Castles Creek is Scottish, not English, and Samore in Ireland, and there's an American organization. So we are very international. It's very important to us. So I wanted to thank our partners, because without them we wouldn't be able to work. It takes a lot of energy and logistics to implement 8 conferences in Europe. So thank you very much. And I wanted to also add that the partners are here because they have experience. If I make the sum of the experience we have here, there's 200 years of experience on treatment of mental health. So the involvement of our partners is also about sharing their knowledge. They have things to share. They are part of the conference. Not here where I am, but among you at the coffee break. You'll have lots to learn from each other. So we have a simultaneous interpreting. The English channel is 3, the French channel is 4, for those of you who want simultaneous interpreting. The majority of this presentations will be in French, apart from the debate this evening of Mike Trace from the UK and Jacques Charlier from the USA, who will speak in English, but the rest of the presentations will be in French. So just a brief word before passing the floor to our first presentation on the agenda. When we started thinking about the agenda for today with Susie Longbottom, who is somewhere here, we asked ourselves what we were going to talk about this year. And we had the idea of talking about something essential, not how we treat addiction, but the human aspect of all that. And Susie said you should, I said listen to the president of the foundation, the Addiction Foundation. There's something he said, and he'll be here this afternoon if he's not already arrived. It's the concept of regulation, human regulation and collective regulation. How can we deal with personality disorders, addiction, through this lens, this emotional regulation, this behavioral regulation, collective regulation? And that struck me, because the way he spoke about it was so full of humanity and structure and thought, well thought out. It stuck with me. I talked to Susie about it, and I remembered that when I was at university 35 years ago here in Paris, I worked on a sentence by André André Malraux, the great addict, and I still remember it 35 years later. And he said, what we call culture is the set of mysterious answers that a man can give to himself when he sees the mirror image of a dead man in the mirror. And I don't know what mark I got, what grade I got for this work, but that stuck with me. There's something to do with addiction in there, and so addiction is something. There's something fundamental that makes people different to other mammals. It's our capacity to interact. I don't think we would be here today if our ancestors hundreds of thousands of years ago didn't realize that we would be stronger together, if united. So my conviction as a psychologist, as a therapeutic, as a researcher, is that ultimately there is the fundamental nature of humanity. So these two thoughts led me to think with Susie, and led to the agenda we have before you, which has a hidden structure which I want to talk to you about before we pass the floor. So I've made this bit complex presentation here, but you'll see there's something behind it. So with the human being in the center, the regulation of our internal and external humanity, the regulation of the collective, because humans are also about the collective. How do we talk about all this? So we're talking about use. I didn't put the presenters' names on this presentation, but it's important that we look at the dynamic. We'll talk about drug use. We're going to talk about it with a fantastic duo, Maxence, who we've known for many years, Fabrice, I'm meeting you for the first time today, but you have something fundamental to teach us about humanity and the position of the addict. And so we'll start with this core, and then we'll move on to how we can help, what do we do, and the experience of the patient when he's decided to leave addiction behind. So we talk about the residential, therapeutic residential solutions and the dedication to becoming better. Philippe Carvoz and Lisa Schur will talk about their experience as French-speaking therapists in an English-speaking treatment center. Then we'll talk about something essential, which is that it's great to have ideas, but how do we go about implementing it? So Susie Longbottom and Rani Duprat will talk about training. There's a lot of things to do. I'm trying to train myself every day because I don't know much about it, apart from the fact that it's difficult to be an addict. Then we're talking about mutual aid, mutual assistance. It's good to have professionals, but we talk about peer support, the parents, others. So we'll have an example of Micheline Clodon with her experience of expert patients and what they can do to boost mutual aid, and to talk about the human condition of the addict, to quote Malraux. Then we need to talk about the systems, what enables all this to take shape, the aid policy, and Ruth Goslan will come and talk about a 5-year plan that the government is is currently setting up. So it's difficult for her to talk about it because it's being in the process of being rolled out now. And then this finally will end with a debate. We had the idea of bringing people from the USA and the UK for their experience. We have things to learn from them. They have things to learn from us. So we're going to share our viewpoints with Michel Reynaud, Jean-Pierre Coutron, Jacques Charlier from the USA with his initiative about the initiatives he's implementing in the USA. Mike Trace from the UK. And once we've done that, we'll be nice and tired, but we'll have done a lot of work. This is what I wanted to share with you before we start. For once, I've not gone over time, so that's good. Thank you very much. Welcome, and let's move on to our work with Maxence and Fabrice. would you kindly come up onto the stage? Fabrice Olivet is late. He'll be here in a few minutes, so I'm going to start. That will make him turn up. So the idea behind this presentation, contrary to appearance, is to work as a duo with, on the one hand, Fabrice Olivet, who is someone who comes from what we call in France self-help, defending users, drug users, who is an activist, a militant activist on the risk reduction in the last 20 years through an association, Drug Users Association, which is called ASUD in France. So the encounter between Fabrice and myself, Maxence Granier, and I come from self-help groups. And I don't obviously want to talk on behalf of them. Self-help groups take great care not to have leadership or spokespersons. They don't need them, and they are not involved in some of our debates. So the encounter between these two paths is what established our thoughts that we wanted to present to you this morning, in particular with respect to history of what's been done in France on the issue of drugs and different models and solutions that have been implemented at various times, and the fundamental idea being to get past certain oppositions that have structured ideologically the way of looking at the issue, to create a new way of looking at it, a new debate. For all Anglo-Saxons and non-French speaking people, these are issues that are related to addiction and drug abuse in France. You'll see, you'll be able to compare with what happens in your various countries. So the important idea behind this, the original idea, is this well-known triptych of the product, the environment, and the individual. The start of the consideration of drug abuse in France was based first on a psychological model, which is put forward by Claude Ovelinstein in 1985, which is highly related to the suffering of the drug user. And the inspiration behind that was Zimberg's book, Drug Set and Setting, to take into account the context, the frame of mind of the drug user and the product itself. So it's a fairly important book. So this approach of Claude Ovelinstein and the Marmitton Center that focuses on the consideration of the drug user to work towards a cure. With the product here, the focus is not the product, is not the drug, because the dependence seems to be a symptom of something else, which may be a trauma in the past and the subject's past. So this is, of course, there's a type of a conjunction between a psychological approach, which is interesting and true, and I think many of you will be involved in therapeutics with people who work in the subject of addiction. We often see that there is a trauma or a difficulty or abuse in the in the subject's past that can explain the active addiction. And as well as this psychological approach, they put a distance between. They put the product, the drug, at a distance because it's seen as something that masks the real cause of the problem, which can be treated. And then we have the emergence of centres which are not really like the centres that you will work in, that most of you will work in, but there are more coercive centres which impose a cutting off or removal of the drug user with the substance. So there's a sort of negotiation between the therapeutic aspect on the one hand and the legal aspect for illicit substances to erect barriers between the user and the substance. So here's Fabrice Olivet, who's arriving discreetly, and who I asked to join me on the floor. So this is the first point in the history of the consideration of addiction. There was a second point, and it's good that Fabrice arrives at this point because he's one of the key players after this first point in history. You remember that Claude Olivenstein was against the distribution of syringes. He wasn't favourable to substitution therapy. And so there was a second point in history, important point in history, which will radically change the relationship to addiction in terms of public policy as well as representation, which is the arrival of AIDS and risk reduction. And this is where I leave the floor to you, which on a subject which you know well. So I'm very sorry. I didn't know that you would start on time, so that obviously illustrates a difference in culture between us. So I apologize. So I suppose that you done an overview of the triptych of Dr. Olivenstein, so I'm not going to insult you by going back over that. But it's very important to establish the difference between the role of the product in the Olivenstein model and the role of the individual, because this builds up, this is foundational to our presentation. So I'm not sure if you explained this, but this is a point in history. I realize that every time I speak to people or younger audiences nowadays, because we have also ourselves become part of history, this is ancient history. This has a strong impact on the present, but the fact that there was a sector of people focusing on drug abuse, or focusing on this type of treatment, for my generation, that was the obvious solution. As drug users, this is the only model we knew. That became but now it's become practically unknown. There's a practically frontal collision with the substitution treatment. So this allows me to make the transition to this slide. So the decree of 1972 of the prohibition of syringes. Most people don't know about this. They know the law of 1970, but they don't know the decree that founded the AIDS and probably hepatitis C epidemic, because the other countries that didn't have this type of decree, this type of prohibition of syringes, did not have among drug users the same level of contamination. This decree was 2 years after the 1970 law, and it's in the same philosophy that concerns us. which is the war on drugs, which implies making a war against drug users. So you can obviously find lots of good reasons for it, but when you analyze it, we'll talk about the biography later. It's in the book that's just come out. My book was called Heroin, the Invisible Catastrophe, and I encourage you to buy it. And in this book, we talk about myself and other people. We talk about the history of this confusion between abstinence and prohibition. We had to wait until 1987 for Michel Barcaud, the brave Minister of Health, to abolish this decree. Bearing in mind, there's this period between 72 and 87 where we knew of the methods, the substitution and replacement of syringes to eliminate the epidemic, but specialists explained to the government that there would be no impact, and in particular Olivenstein, who deserve a lot of recognition as well. The idea is not to stigmatize Olivenstein. Treatment centers were the only place these people were accepted. It was the only shelter they had, but Dr. Olivenstein was completely opposed to this, in particular for treatment to methadone, for reasons that we will see once again when we analyze the sector as it is today. So Michel Barcaud, who I interviewed when I started with iCAAD, who confirmed that the main opponents to his decree were workers, drug workers, who said not only will it be not effective, but what we know about drug use, for the syringes, it will facilitate the use of drugs. So the expression dealers in white coats has been this expression has been attributed to various people, but it is a good summary of some people's perception of drug replacement therapy by general practitioners. So there was a conceptual opposition for this risk reduction solution, which is really supported by militants, by activists. It's an alliance of general practitioners, militants, drug users, who had a humanistic rather than medical point of view. So obviously there's a medical justification. It's all about surviving, but that was a medical approach was reduced to its most simple expression, which was talking about the fight against stigmatization and create these relatively simple tools, including substitution, which we will then see later and will then completely replace the former model. That explains why people like myself, who started by wanting to save our skins, were completely against anything that remind us of this activism of abstinence. I spoke to Marie Geoffrey recently, who interviewed me at the time. I used to think that even the self-help groups, discussion groups, and anonymous groups were not self-help, were not mutual support groups. They were interiorizing their stigma. They were accomplices, in a sense, of this propaganda that was fighting again. I'm talking about this, telling you this, because it explains this gap that has been created by risk reduction militants and mutual support groups, which was made up. And these two groups really should have been speaking to each other naturally, because they had the same culture. So in '96, Subutex was launched, we were estimating 10,000 treatments, and by 1998 there was 100,000 treatments in France. And now we can talk about how much space this risk reduction, this substitution method took up in the landscape.
So this is really the third model, which is the one that is still in place in France right now, or at least it's the main model in use in France. And the product has once again is again at the center, or gets back at the center. It's a medicalization approach with the Parquet report that really insisted on several notions, the question of use, abuse, and addiction. And we focus mostly on addiction, but the idea in the background is that addiction is a chronic disease. It's a disease of the brain, and in order to give care to the patients, you need to rebalance synapses, and you need to, faced with the imbalance linked to the consumption of or the use of psychotropic drugs, you need to move towards a substitution model. Interruption is not really a possibility. So the idea is still very much an idea that is important today. The idea is that it is a chronic disease. That idea of chronicity is an idea that we have in common with the Minnesota approach. So we will see that what really matters is that the definition of the disease is not exactly the same. So you can see today that that model has become more and more powerful, that medicalized model, with the possibility to change the name between drug substitution treatment to drug addiction treatment. And this is specifically very interesting, and one of the most interesting things about me and Fabrice working hand in hand. I come from approaches based on abstinence. You come from the world of risk reduction. You come from a world where substitution was considered as the solution at a specific moment, like a survival, a necessity for survival. And here we have something, there's the question of stopping treatment, the interruption of treatment, which is a very important question. It's a bit of a paradoxical situation. In the end, the products might not be exactly the same. They do not lead to the same psychotropic states, but there is some level of addiction to those treatments then. So addiction remains, and the word weaning in French, sevrage, has several meanings. There's one meaning that would lead to abstinence, and then another sense, another meaning, which is weaning yourself off your product of choice, which is very often illegal. But that weaning process is only made possible because you can substitute that product with another product which is legal, which has been prescribed by a doctor. I even sometimes hear people talk about substitution with medicalized heroin, which in the end seems a bit paradoxical to me. And there's always that question of aging populations, aging addicts who have access to those treatments. Can they be weaned off the treatment as well? And of course, there's always the question of basically heroin, which was invented to say to help morphine addicts, and now we have methadone to help heroin addicts. So, okay, if you're done, maybe I can take over again. Sure. All right. So here, what really matters from the point of view of the movement that I represent, and within which iCAAD is active. So we're activists for risk reduction activists. We were taken up in a kind of a big wave at the beginning of the 2000, and then it got even stronger. There was a big wave of protest with people who saved their own lives thanks to substitution treatments, and they decided, to work on substitution, to work very hard on it, to try to promote it. And once there, we also ended up getting therapy for HIV, which was very important as well. And all of that converged, and we ended up being prisoners of a kind of chemical cage. We might not have understood how powerful that chemical cage would be, or how much of a constraint. We have people taking up to 2-3 milligrams of methadone, and when they try to wean themselves off methadone, they end up facing problems that they might not have not have envisioned, or that they might not have expected. So I think it's important to insist on the fact that several molecules also are addictive. And I think a lot of carers, instead of taking care of that problem, taking it seriously, just basically swept it under the rug. And we had that consideration of lifelong treatment, chronic brain disease, and so on and so forth. But there's not always a reason to stop taking a treatment. There's a very common comparison with diabetes, for example. Within the framework of diabetes, people who stop taking insulin or stop their insulin treatment are in danger, put themselves in danger. And I think a lot of carers and a lot of medical healthcare professionals really believe that weaning yourself off substitution therapy is dangerous. And we have some studies about treatment interruption, and they all insist on the mortality rate of people who stop taking substitution therapy versus people who take lifelong treatment. I have been reading that in quite a lot of articles as well. Patients sometimes negotiate with their doctors in order to reduce the treatment or to stop treatment, and that can sometimes be interpreted as a necessity to increase the dose. So if a patient says, I want to stop treatment, I want to decrease the dose, sometimes that is interpreted by doctors as a preliminary stage to potential relapse. I think it's always interesting when you see the history of opiates, heroin, invented to help morphine addicts, and so, there's that kind of an idea of substituting the one with the other, and that creates kind of a chain of events. All right, so I'm sure you're all familiar with the Minnesota model. It's the 12-step model based on abstinence, which is linked to the birth or the creation of peer support groups, non-professional ones, with, of course, AA focused on alcohol, and NA as well, that was then also focusing on narcotics. So we moved beyond products in order to focus more on the notion of addiction in a very broad sense. That's a movement that is very interesting for addictology as a whole, of course. There's also that idea of destigmatizing the concept of disease. We use that concept in order to remove the stigma. And this is something that was used very early on in the USA as well, with substitution experiments with methadone in the 60s. But this disease is not just a physical disease, it's also a psychological disease, it's also a spiritual disease, and this is really the distinction between illness or pathology from a very scientific perspective and the use of the word disease in terms of the abstinence approach. So we, again, focus on recovery without focusing too much on the cause. The idea is not to solve a problem or the initial problem, whether it be conscious or whether the patient be aware of it or not. The idea is really to focus on recovery. It doesn't. I mean, that doesn't mean that the cause does not matter. And I think in the clinic, in practice, a lot of people do a bit of both, focus on both on recovery and on the root cause of addiction. A lot of people work on themselves and have approaches that are closer to psychology or psychoanalysis. But the cause is no longer at the center of the problematic. And we also have the creation, based on the American model, we have the creation of rehabilitation centers, shelters, clinics, that all share and implement those types of approaches that focus both on professionalized approaches and peer support approaches based fundamentally on helping each other out, addicts helping other addicts. And there's also that question of self-help. There have been several movies actually in France recently that focused on those types of approach. There was a movie by Cédric Kahn called The Prayer, La Prière, and another one by Marine Darel, The Party's Over, La Fête est finie. And then another one, I can't remember the title, however. Our Wonderful Lives, Nos Vies Formidables. So 3 movies about that recently. And then there's also the emergence of counselors, which are kind of an in-between between a professional and a non-professional support stakeholder, and also an abstinence clinic. So I just wanted to give you a general description of the history of all that, and I wanted with Fabrice to think about the relationships that may exist between those 4 models. And what particularly interests me is that those relationships evolve with time. So we have a first model, which is the biomedical model, which is focused on the neurological approach. It's mostly focused on weaning, even though it's a weaning process that maintains a specific level of dependence, because it's about substitution, and it's based on pharmacotherapy. And that first model has always been opposed or separated from a more psychosocial approach with trauma, addiction as a symptom, and the idea is to become abstinent, to wean yourself completely of all products, and that's more of the psychotherapy approach. Right now, nowadays, we are trying to have a synthetic, a holistic approach of addictology in order to get the best or take the best out of those 2 options. Those models are top-down models. The idea is you go to an institution and the institution helps you. Science, the medical world can help you. And this is very much linked to the question of public policy, prohibition, and other issues, other similar issues. Then there's the model of risk reduction, based on self-help, peer support, very much linked to AIDS and Hep C, major healthcare catastrophes that are linked to addiction or that are connected to addiction, because you have those are vector-borne diseases that can be linked to injections or to syringes, for example, and that is an approach that really insists on the question of access to substances and the question of practices as well. And then there's also the other model that is very much a bottom-up approach, with peer support groups, the idea of recovery, the promotion of a program that helps you change your behavior with a spiritual dimension, which in France is has been a barrier to its use for a very long period of time. So those 2 models have also been opposed in the past, or have been considered as in opposition. And with Fabrice, we determined that this opposition is probably going to disappear, or should probably disappear. So on the left-hand side, you have models that are supported by substitution, and here on the right-hand side, you have models that are based on abstinence, but in a slightly different way. So what I find particularly interesting is, I wrote an article about that actually in iCAAD. I think it's important to be very careful that 12-step model, that 12-step model may sometimes be flirting with that idea of a war on drugs. I mean, peer support groups do not take position on those subjects, but there could be a question of, because abstinence is such a big deal within that model, you may get a bit too close to that notion of war on drugs, and yes, this is one of the worries that I know you had with regards to peer support groups. Abstinence is an individual choice, even though it's supported by a group. This is very different in nature from the compulsory abstinence supported by prohibition. And I think that this is one of the things at stake. And then on the other side, you can see that substitution. With the idea of chronic disease and lifelong treatment, this is not exactly the same as a chosen substitution linked to a crisis where AIDS was killing a lot of people, and so there are some distinctions that have to be made as well. So on the right-hand side, you deal with a model that takes into account individuals, where it's very human-centric, and I think this is what Olivenstein really brought to the table. You can see that everything is focused on the individual. The individual is the one that is at the center of the approach, whereas on the left-hand side, you have that question of substitution of the product. But both models that are bottom-up focus more on the context. With peer support groups, and with the Minnesota approach, you try to change the context. And for the risk reduction concept as well, you try to take context much more into account. What you can see today is that from the perspective of the biomedical and psychosocial model, addictology tries to integrate both psychological and biological aspects, or at least this is the intention. And what I find particularly interesting, and this is really what's so important about trying to work together with Fabrice, I mean, the idea is that between the drug addict or someone who's actively using drugs and who's trying to create strategies to take better care of themselves or of others, and the recovery model, you have obviously big differences, but you also have a lot of things that are in common. A form of empowerment, for example, and at the bottom of it all, the idea of moving beyond the opposition of risk reduction and the abstinence approach through the creation of a new theme. It is true that in the recovery model, you tend to insist on, I mean, you have that opposition, fundamental opposition between using drugs and recovering, which makes sense, obviously, but still you also need to have a look at the continuity of those two aspects. And I think that the notion of group support, the idea of recovery as an approach, for example, has become a substitute for something that was mostly focused on the relationship to the product. There are some continuity questions at play here, and I think that it's important to underline those continuities between the experience of addiction and the experience of recovery around that notion of group support, of peer support as well. Now, in terms of the chronicity, which we have for both the biomedical and the 12-step model, the fact that it's incurable, the whole distinction operates around the notion of disease. And you can see that the link between the psychosocial social model and the risk reduction model is the idea of potential regulation, the possibility for regulation. If there's an underlying cause, and if you can get rid of that underlying cause or find a solution to it, then maybe you could move on to more regulated use, more controlled use. And I think this is also the model of risk reduction. And I think this is very different from the abstinence or complete abstinence models. So if you like, depending on the countries, the culture, the moment, those models have not had the same weight. The Minnesota model, as I said, in France, It took a bit of time to be imported to France. It's still very much a minority of people who participate in such models, but there's still that question of peer support. And the last thing that I wanted to mention also was that you have questions of public policy that are at stake here, and you can see that the uppermost models, whether it be by prescription or prohibition of injunction models, that are still based on the distinction between what's legal and what is not. I mean, this is very clear in terms of substitution, for example. There is a legal category that matters quite a lot in terms of the difference between products, between their properties. And I believe that on the other side, at the bottom of my slide, you have the bottom-up approaches, and that there's the question of choice that is very important there. And there is, I mean, the line is sometimes blurred between what is legal and what is not. Alcohol and heroin are both of them addictive products, and abstinence for both of those products means the same, but there's also the question of self-help and peer support. I think we are dealing with models that, I mean, they question the patient and the patient's choices, and they are really, those models are probably going to become more liberal. And I think the peer support groups don't really talk about those questions, but I think a lot of people who are getting better now have also been advocates or people who are very much convinced by the approach of deprohibition or legalization of use. We created all the slides together. I had not seen this one. So if I may just take the floor again just for a second, if you don't mind, there's one thing that I do not agree with. I think there's something missing in there, you know, with a risk reduction approach. You haven't really talked about the political approach, and I think that is kind of similar to the spirituality aspect in the 12 steps model. You talked about a gap, a delta. And I think there is an obvious political use of the 12-step model by a certain number of stakeholders. I have been an advocate all my life. The question of ASUD, for me, my organization, the idea was mostly to change drug policy. A long time ago, long before the question of caring for drug addicts, even though there were questions of life and death because of AIDS, but still, I mean, fundamentally, what we focused on was discrimination. This is what we were taking issue with, because that question of AIDS, again, I insist on it. I insist on the weight of public policy. Public policy is what boosted or supported, kind of created or covered the AIDS epidemics. So I think that political commitment, and I think most ASUD advocates at the start, that political dimension is key. I mean, we wanted to change drug policies. We wanted to create a model for legalization. I was really surprised when I arrived for the first time in the USA. I was invited by the Drug Policy Alliance, so a group of advocates who wanted to transform drug policies in the USA. And I saw that a lot of people were taking the floor, a lot of people who were participating in 12 steps programs, and who are very much against the war on drugs. Back then, there is also something that I need to talk about. Back then, I discovered also the kind of the blurred lines between the war on drugs in the US and racial questions as well. Racial questions that are obviously important to me as well, and important to France. And I think I noticed how much a lot of those 12 steps advocates belonged to the African American community. They were they were talking about the war on their community as well as the war on drugs, and they were talking about their own personal progress towards abstinence. And I think this was the first shock for me, the first epiphany, I suppose. And then I met Martin Knecht and Susie, who's here as well, and I discovered that in France as well we have a certain number of people who were participating in 12 Steps programs and who shared that political approach, that political vision that we had as well. The very important question of injustice. I mean, we have structures that organize or that regulate drugs, structures that are based on prohibition, and I realized that there was no opposition between the 12 Steps programs and the political commitment that I was involved in. So the question of choice, I think we explained everything quite clearly. So the question is, why we come from very different walks of lives. Some people may even consider that we come from radically opposed walks of lives. And the question of choice, I believe, to my mind, is the fundamental question. When I talk about political vision for iCAAD, it's also because of that, the question of choice, choosing to use or choosing not to use or to stop using. And this translates into very simple things. You might have different ways of talking about it, but there's the question of will. And in choice there is a dignity, there is a credibility in the approach of a drug addict. I mean, I am not a member of those movements, but I think the idea that you can choose to go to a meeting every day, for example, I can compare that to the choice of taking drug substitution therapy. That idea of a choice, choosing to take substitution or choosing not to take it anymore. The anecdote that Maxence was talking about, the idea of having if a patient says, I want to quit substitution therapy, to maybe consider increasing the dose, for example. This is also very much influenced by big pharma making recommendations, pharmaceutical companies making recommendations. In the question of substitution treatments, the question of the discovery of a new market, the addiction market, there are, of course, quite large financial interests at stake. So we must fight, in the end, nearly as hard as we fought against the war on drugs and people who wanted to force us to wean ourselves off of drugs and to become abstinent. We also have to fight nearly as hard with that idea of lifelong treatment. I was really struck and particularly interested. I wrote an article about that in the iCAAD journal. I think with the 12 Steps programs, you insist a lot on the dignity of the participant. They are invited to find their way back to dignity in a way. And to me, there's a parallel with the fact that, from a political point of view, users have taken ownership of those questions because they no longer want to be the puppets of a specific political approach. They also don't want to be the puppets of a specific product. So they want to get back to dignity. They want to be empowered. And then there's that question of the group as well. The expertise in terms of consumption and recovery, the collective approach, the peer support approach, and the importance of non-stigmatization, which is the precondition for both individual and collective solutions in a world where drugs are prohibited. And the question that I am interested in is, in the end, how can abstinence approaches and harm reduction approaches evolve in a world where there is a risk that we will move towards a deprohibition approach? And I think this is really very much what is at stake. You talked about the political dimension versus the spiritual dimension, and it's true. I mean, the question of citizenship, the question of expertise, non-stigmatization, everything that I called the bottom-up approach. All of those aspects are very interesting, and it's also very interesting to determine what the links are between those different approaches in order to end up with a holistic approach, something that is less of a caricature, so that in the future we can benefit from all the positive aspects from the medical perspective, but also from the public policy perspective.
Do you want to conclude? By all means, do we have a conclusion, or should I improvise? Oh yes. So this is we just mentioned. Think that things have changed. I hope you've understood that. Otherwise, we'll have to go back over it. It's true that, in my opinion, the future will be based more on this new reality. On the one hand, a continued prohibition, which continues to hurt people around the world, and which uses different instruments depending on the country. On the one hand, a war, a brutal traditional war, and on the other hand, medicalization, which has already been spoken about by Michel Foucault, among others. And this, the use of the group, should take more and more space in this discussion of drug use. And on paper, we can see that a lot is being done on the democratization of health. There are conferences on the hearing drug users. We had a conversation earlier with Jean-Max, who, as usual, said that you are very incisive, or too incisive, maybe a little too much anyway. We've done a lot recently in terms of public policy to get to hear the voices of drug users. So I'll take the role of the bad cop, and as the bad cop who's never happy, I'm suspicious of words that are not followed by action. Sometimes it's harder to fight against things that seem like they're effective, but they don't go to the end of the logical conclusion. And in this issue of health democracy, is focused entirely on care and not at all on democracy. There's the healthcare system organizes spokespersons within its own system, but while retaining the control over it. And I'm well placed to know that to what extent politics, the policies that an organization like ASUD can have, is seen in a bad light from pharmaceutical companies. And we haven't even spoken about, oh yes, we did talk about the change of the domination, which is typical of this hypocritical approach of health democracy, because this change of name is based on destigmatization, an argument of destigmatization. That was what was always argued, that it would always be stigmatizing. But stigmatizing for who? For doctors, because they refuse to prescribe, because once again there is hypocrisy. Because one of the main substitutes are not prescribed and they're not delivered. Even so, on this issue of the blurred lines, we're at the dawn, at the start of a fight that is just starting. And ultimately, the idea is to organize a society where drugs exist, where it is easier to both control the negative effects for those who choose to use them, but also to leave addiction for those who are prisoner of the parameters organized by themselves, out of their own free will. More this model, the more this model is implemented, the more free will be. So it's just some bibliography for the reference for the books that we cited in this presentation. And that's the end of our presentation.